become more important to yourself first, because I'm sure he wasn't as depressed after he realized that he had done something important. And he had something important maybe to share with some other people. So this is the item that I want to discuss with you. I have so many stories. In North Shore Towers, where I talk regularly, right over here in Floral Park, it's a huge cooperative apartments. It's a private golf course, a private country club where I speak there. A woman came in with her walker, and this goes back again 9 years ago, and she told the following story. She said, when I was in my 20s, she was 92, so that you're talking 70, back in the early 30s, she was traveling in Russia, an American woman. And she said, I was traveling in Russia, and I was on the Volga River, and I was on this filthy boat, and the weather was terrible, the food was terrible, but she was an adventuresome woman. You know, if a woman was traveling alone back in those days, you really had to be kind of adventurous, especially since she was American. She said, but I met a young man, and we kept each other warm at night. And this is from a woman in a walker, and as she told this, she let go of her walker, and she stood straighter, and her voice got stronger. Well, there was an immediate electricity. Now I'm talking about 200 people, because when I talk there, there's about 200 people listening. And all of a sudden, like either they wanted to hear more from her, or they maybe wanted to tell her some stories too. Because that's the thing about telling stories like this, is that people want to then come back and tell you a story. And everybody that tells a story, by the way, smiles. I've never had a person tell a story that didn't smile and enjoy telling that story. Okay? So the point, what I'm trying to say is this woman, okay, who said that, came back to this country, got married, had children, and after the war, or just before the war, however it was, this man escaped Russia and came over here. And she had him over for dinner, and then he went his way, and she hers. She had great-grandchildren by this time, and she said he has great-grandchildren by this time, and he doesn't live anywhere near New York. She grew up in Great Neck and lived with her family there. And so he left out of state. But for every month, for 70 years or so, they have conversed with each other, either by phone or by letter. Now this is unrequited love or different kind of love, because she was happily married, he was happily married, but they had some connection. There's some feeling, okay? And that's really what I'm trying to say. And these are people from the audience, like yourself, telling these stories, okay? At the very same place, and I got 2 stories that night at the Towers, it's called North Shore Towers. A woman stood up and said, you know, I knew why you were coming, and I want to show you what I've done. Like you've said what you've done, you've said what happened in your family. She said, I knew why you were coming, and she showed a book this thick. She said, my parents were married for 60-something years, and every month my father would write a love letter to my mother. And this is the book, and I had 60 books prepared. I had one big impasse, though, to the whole thing. It was all in Yiddish. So she had to find somebody to translate that, but she produced 60 books for the future, as you said, for the future generations. People that will never know her or her parents have this book about their roots. Remember back, was it Huxley? Not Huxley. Haley. Alex Haley. He wrote about roots, about the black slave experience. Roots. Even for slaves, it was important for people who had become free and now are free. Their roots was important to them, as your family tree is important to you, as you are, in a sense, interested in educating your granddaughter in what it is to be an Italian. Okay? The fact is, every race, ethnicity, person has a desire to do it, but most don't do it. And most young people have a desire, even if they don't even show it or mention it. Later in life, they'll feel they miss something if they don't have it. So that's another. So I can have story after story, but you know, I don't want to stop anybody here from telling a story that has shown some warmth and some connection with other people and family. Yes?
I don't know this. I was in a play 76 years ago. I was 8 years of age then.
Oh, very nice.
Now my granddaughter, 8 years of age, she was in the Charlie Brown Christmas in
Oh,
California.
very beautiful, yes.
And this is what they wrote about her. In terms of the acting, the entire cast did a great job, but Sierra O'Tilly Coleman, who played Charlie's sister, truly shines. She delivers with wit and youthful experience.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing that. But those are the wonderful things to remember and to keep and pass on to other people. Yes, sir.
Yeah, in other words, you feel that something is lost, where 90% of the GIs, World War II, won't talk about my grandchildren, and my wife never knew.
Well, you are guilty.
Excuse me?
You're guilty.
Why?
Because they would like to have some of those stories. I mean, some of them you have to clean up. I understand that. I don't know what you did, but some of them you might have to clean up. Okay, don't tell those stories.
90% of GI World War II won't talk.
Don't tell those war stories. Tell the good war stories. Okay? Well, the point is that I'm sure you did something good. I'm sure you did well, you're laughing, so there must have been something that pleased you. Well, some of those stories they might be desirous of sharing with them, taking from you and keeping. I have stories about my parents or my grandparents or even myself that I've shared with my children, and that's why my daughter wrote that poem that I read to you earlier.
The war period of life.
Well, but that's you. You were there, and you saw things, and you had thoughts and ideas and feelings, which I showed you is priceless, priceless. You may not become a famous author, you may not become a famous television personality, but they're worth a lot to them because you are part of them. They are part of you. They want to feel like they have some substance, some past. All people have that down deep, and you're doing a disfavor if you don't share some of that information. I just want to pass on a few more stories, okay? The fact is that my son, as an example, is an artist, and he met some people. He used to teach English as a second language in the city, and strange things happen, as this lady said, strange connections about meeting people and so forth. He was teaching, and two sisters came from Sweden to attend his class only because they came here every year because they wanted to learn English better. One was a grandmother, and her sister had grown children. And they liked my son, and he liked them. And he somehow told them he was an artist, and they saw some of his paintings. They invited him to Sweden. And he lived with one of them, and he had an art show in Sweden. My wife and I traveled to Scandinavia to see my son's show, and we obviously saw all of, while we were there, we went through all the other Scandinavian countries. But the fact is, now the husband of this woman he lived with was a teacher, a musician, but I didn't know, or he never said what else he did. And when we were over his house, he said, we were talking about traveling in Europe, because we were traveling, we've traveled extensively in Europe. He says, yes, well, he has too. Obviously lives in Sweden, and he had easy access to travel, right? And he had a row of books on his shelf. And he says, well, as an example, he pulled one of these little books out. And on one side, in calligraphy writing, was a story about the trip. On the other was a penned sketch that showed a scene from that trip. And he had row after row of these books of trips that he and his wife and his children had taken. It was publishable, truly publishable. It was of that beautifully written, illustrated, and I said, this he did for himself and for his children and his grandchildren. Unbelievable. So some people do have that desire to share and want to do that, and this man did it obviously very artistically. But there are so many other stories that I could talk about. Are there any other stories that some of you have not shared or would like to? Okay. In one of my talks at the Atria in Great Neck, as I speak at all the Atrias and all the Bristols and the Sterling Glens, but this one, a woman said, you know, I grew up in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, and we had no running water, we had no indoor bathroom. This is back, she was in her 80s, 9 years ago, so obviously it was 90-something, 80 and 90 years ago. And she said, but when I first went to school, the day I started kindergarten, I was very excited, my mother presented me with this beautiful little dress. And I just fell in love with it. It was so beautiful. I had never had something like this. And my plans were to go to school with a neighbor girl who was going to come by, and we would walk together. The neighbor girl came by, and she was wearing the same dress. Now, a lot of women say, oh my goodness, that's terrible. She said, oh, it was so fantastic. I remember every little detail. And we walked hand in hand to school together like twins. So she remembered something, and she was smiling, and she could see it was an aura of warmth about her, remembering something 80 years before. This is how things affect you. This is how things are affected. My mother used to tell a story about me. When my mother was from Baltimore and I'm from Boston. We lived in Boston. And we used to drive twice a year to Baltimore. And it was a 14-hour drive then. They didn't have all the bridges and tunnels they have now. We had to go through ferries and other things. I remember that. But we used to, and I don't know if you remember bench seats, no seat belts, okay? And we used to travel for 14 hours. And one day we came back home, and my mother said, oh my goodness, we'll grab a bite to eat and we'll all go to bed. And I said, oh my goodness. And I was 3 years old. I said, after we eat, can we go for a ride? This is after standing between my mother and my father in the front seat for 14 hours. And I love to drive. I've driven all over Europe. I've driven all over the United States. And so it shows you some things from your past revisit you at the present time as well. So these stories, and not that the story makes me feel good, but when I write it and tell my children that story, it just makes them, there's a further connection between us. I was 3 years old once? How could that be? So there's all sorts of levels here of satisfaction and pleasure for each and every one of us. To end today, I want to just talk about how you do this. You all remember, do you remember ice boxes?
Yeah.
Do you remember having to crank up a car to start the car? It wasn't that long ago, was it? Do your children know about it? Do they know about it? Those are stories that, if you can recall them about parents or yourself even, are very wonderful to hear about. They may see it in an old movie, they don't connect. They said, my God, my father used to do that too, or my grandfather used to do that. All these things. I remember the icemen coming and grabbing a piece of ice, right? We used to call them ice boxes, didn't we? They weren't refrigerators, they were ice boxes, right? And the coal man used to come because they didn't deliver oil, they delivered coal. I lived in an apartment in Boston, okay? And I'm sure if you lived in New York, get coal delivered, not oil, or not natural gas, right? Or the milkman came, right? He said, like, the milk is here, right? Those are stories that are priceless to tell children and grandchildren, because it's, you know, nowadays, what do? They look at a cell phone, right? This is, my God, that's an old one, right? I mean, if you have, my God, you know, 10 years from now, they'll say, so what's the big deal about this phone? You know, I just looked in my ring and I talked in my ring. It's fine. Why did you have to have this big thing? The point is, you had party lines when you had phones. You didn't have individual phones and phones in every room. You had to share the room down the hall or a pay phone somewhere. So these are stories about those things that are priceless for children and grandchildren. And you should write some of that down, or record it, or do some sort. And by watching old movies, by reading books, by doing different things, you do get to impart that to them. And it'll give you pleasure. Believe me, it will give you pleasure. You will see pleasure in them, and it will give you pleasure to do it. So, and in parting today, I do implore you to continue doing that kind of thing. And remember, you are the magic. Make the magic happen. And you, sir, write those stories down. Thank you very much.